Okay, today's going to be a little different than usual. We're going to go through two halachas and do 3 different points each rather briefly. Okay, and the first is in Siman Kuf Zayin, halacha Aleph. The Rama is talking about a case about cooking eggs. I'm going to explain it in a minute what that is. At the end, he says, things. It's a question whether something is mutter or asur, and he says, "If vafilu das oisrim, ein lesser keilim shenispasu boy namidim hakir cheskasei." He says, even though some people think that the eggs are usher in this case, even those people, it's okay. The kli that you cook the eggs in stays mutter, and because the kli has a cheskes heter, because before the shaila came up, we knew that the kli was mutter, was kosher. Now a shaila came up, so don't worry about that shaila as far as it can, because it has followed the cheskes issur. Now, if you just read it without knowing too much detail, you would think that means that's a general rule. Whenever we have a shaila about a food, that even though we have to be machmir at the food itself, because we don't want to eat issur, but there's a cheskes heter on the kli, and we don't have to kash the kli, which would be a huge kula, a big heter, to say anytime there's a shaila, and it's a safek, even for machmir on the food we make on the kli, but that's not true, and that's why I'm here to explain why that's not true. And that's because now we have to look back at the case to understand what's going on, and then we'll understand why it's a very specific kula in this case. And that was like this. The person cooked a lot of eggs in a pot, more than 61 eggs. And he figured out afterwards that one of the eggs was treif. It had a chicken inside of it. That chicken was growing inside of it. Okay. So, of course, he's going to throw out that egg, because that egg is not kosher. But the question is, what about the rest of the eggs that are in there? So what it stands like this: before he takes any eggs out of the pot, then the Blios from the treif egg are going to be spreading to all the other eggs, and it'll be Bitul. It'll be Bitul b'shishim, because there's enough eggs in the pot to be mevatel all the Blios coming out of the treif egg. But the thing is like this: if you pour the eggs while they're still hot, if you pour the eggs out of the pot while they're still hot, then what's going to happen is that some of those eggs will become treif. As follows: let's say the egg that's treif comes out. Let's say we pour it out in 3 batches, 20 eggs each batch. If the treif egg comes out in the first batch, then the eggs in that batch will be treif, because you'll have 1 treif egg and only 20 kosher eggs. So then the blia will not be Bitul, and those eggs would become treif. If it comes out in the last batch, then the last 20 eggs would be treif, because again, for the same reason that the one egg that's the one egg that's treif only has 20 eggs. Its time is only spread into 20 eggs, so then those eggs are going to be treif. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch tells you what you're supposed to do is you should let the eggs cool down to be below yatzla. That's what it means. They stay with all these 61 eggs should stay together until there's no more possibility for time to transfer, and then at that point you could take them out. This way, the treif egg is always together with the 60 treif kosher eggs, and it's never at a point that it's with less than 60 eggs. Okay, so that's what you're supposed to do. Okay, so what happens? But you didn't do that. Okay, and you poured them all out in a couple, like I said before, in a couple of batches. Okay, and you don't know which one was the treif. If you knew which one it was, you would say that the treif egg is in that batch, and that whole batch would be treif. But let's say you don't know what happens. Okay, so the Rama brings 2 days about whether what to do in that case. He happens to be that he favors the more mekel, and he says, but you should know, even the machmirim will agree that you could use the pot, because the pot has a cheskes heter. So what's going on like this? The Maral explains like this. He says, really, there's lots of reasons why the egg should be mutter. Okay, and really, from a purely, if we could use the word halachic perspective, we'd be makel and say that the eggs are all permitted. That's the truth. The reason we'll be machmir over here is because a person who's standing by, who doesn't understand all the fine details of these kind of things, would look at it and say, how could it be that all the eggs are kosher? I know that the treif egg came out in one of those batches, and in the batch that it came out with, it was not bitul b'shishim. He says, so something's got to be treif over. It can't be that none of the eggs are treif. I know that the treif egg came out only with 20 other eggs, and when it came out with those 20 eggs, the bleed from it was not Bitul. So it's mishum echucha v'tlula. It's going to look to people like something like this is a joke. Something looks wrong over here. That everything could be mutter. It's not possible to the average person looking at it, looks at it and says, this halacha that the Chacham said, that the rabbi told us, that in this case all the eggs are kosher, that it's not, it doesn't go into their heads that could possibly be true. So therefore, we have to ask all the eggs for this reason, mishum chucha v'tzlula, to avoid the rabbi's psak looking silly. We say to the person, make them all asa. Okay, that's fine for the eggs themselves, but for the pot, it's possible that the pot is kosher. How is it possible the pot is kosher? If the eggs came out any time before the last batch, if the eggs came out, in the first batch, then the pot will be kosher. Because the eggs came out in the first batch, whenever the egg was in the pot, it was together with 60 other eggs. When it left the pot, it was, once it left the pot, it might have made some eggs treif, but once it left the pot, it can't make the pot treif anymore. So therefore, it's possible that the pot is kosher even though the eggs are treif, and therefore we could rely on cheskes heter to say that the pot, we can assume that that's what happened in that way, and there's no issue of chucha v'tlula because it doesn't look like a silly psak. It's possible that the psak is correct. So it's a very, very specific case where we say that even though the food is treif, the kli stays kosher. It's a very specific case where we do that, but otherwise we wouldn't say it. Usually, if the food is treif, then the pot is treif also. Okay, now there are some other exceptions. Like sometimes foods are treif for non-tam reasons. Like maybe the food is treif because it has a color of treif in it, or it has a maimed of treif. So there are certain other cases where that's something that affects the food, but it has nothing to do with the treif tam, and therefore it doesn't affect the kli. But otherwise, in normal cases where something is treif, and it's actually treif, it has a treif tam to it also, then the kli is just as treif as the food is also. Okay, now that was number one. Now, the second thing is, we're going to move to Siman Kuf Ches Halach Aleph. It's all about Reichah. And we've talked about that in the past. I'm not going to do all those details again. We talked about it once in this series. We spoke about it when we did Hagal's Keilim. Back then in the middle there also, we spoke about Reichah and Hevel HaKadera and we're going to talk about Zayah at other times, but we've talked about those kind of things in the past and about Reichah. Pesach, when things are more chomer. And for today, I want to just talk about a specific thing that's with particular to Siman Kuf Ches over here, this Kuf Ches Halach Aleph. So if you start learning this Sif, you see that the Shulchan Aruch and the Poskim talk lots about whether an oven is a large oven or a small oven, and I'm going to explain what those are in a minute. That's what I'm going to tell you about in a minute. And they also talk about whether the chamber, the cooking chamber, is completely enclosed, like it has no exhaust vent, if it has an exhaust vent, or if it's totally open on the top. Okay, 3 different variations of how an oven could be set up. And the truth is that nowadays all these different shitas are not so relevant to us, since just about every one of our devices that we cook with has an exhaust vent. And the poskim tell us that in those cases, whether the oven is large or small, we l'chatchila avoid reicha, but b'diavad we're going to be matir if there's a small vent in the back. Now, I know that there's, if you read the Machaber, it sounds like there are cases that are completely mutter, like this might be completely mutter, but if you really dig into it, based on there's a Taz over there and the Shach and the way the issur brings it, all kinds of things like that. In the end, the long and short of it is when we get to it is that it turns out that the cases that the Machaber is machmar lechatchila, and the cases the machmar lechatchila, and the cases the Ramah says are not even mutter b'diavad and only mutter lechatchila, etc., are really very similar cases. And for us, where we always have exhaust vents in just about every one of our devices. Again, I'm going to give you an exception in a minute, but in almost every one of our devices has an exhaust vent. Then whether it's large or small, the din is lechatchila. You avoid reicha and you matir b'diavad. I should have been saying reicha is. I thought it was obvious that reicha means is that this tam can transfer from one food to another food, like vapors transferring from one to another. Tam can go from one to another without them actually touching or being in contact with each other. So for Pesach, the halacha is more chomer, and there it makes a difference whether the oven is large or small. If you have a large oven with a vent, then the food is mutter b'diavad, just like all year round. But if there's no vent, then it would only be mutter in case of hefsed meruba. And if it would be a small oven, whether it has a vent or not, if it's a small oven, then the food, again, is only mutter if it has hefsed meruba. Now, one exception to these rules that I'm telling you, that basically it makes no difference whether the oven is big or small, because we always have our vent, is hot boxes. Because most hot boxes are considered large ovens. Size-wise, I'm going to talk about size in a second, but most of them are size enough that they're considered a large oven. And most of them also have no exhaust vent. And I'm going to explain the difference between them in a second, but most of them have no exhaust vent. And the din over there is that the food is only mutter makom hefsed meruba, Pesach or year round, okay, or all year round. In those kind of cases, like if you had a tray of one food on two different trays, one was kosher, one was treif, it's a large oven, but since it doesn't have an exhaust vent, the food is only mutter b'makom hefsed meruba. Okay, now to give some more detail on hot boxes, is that most hot box, okay, is this big, basically just big metal box. And you use it. It holds trays and trays of food, or trays that have plates of food in them. And most times their use is it's a way to keep food hot. Okay, that means to say is sometimes you warm up food in them, but usually that just to keep the food hot. They're insulated, and most of them have a heater on the bottom of them. So what it is it doesn't make sense to put a vent into this device, because if you put the vent in, just causes the hot air to escape out of it. So most of them do, at least most that I'm familiar with, do not have an exhaust vent. They're just this big insulated box with a heater on the bottom of it. And that's what I was talking about a minute ago when I told you that even if it's large, which most of them are considered large, they don't have an exhaust vent, and therefore the food, if kosher and treif are in there together, the food is only mutter b'makom hefsed meruba even year round, even not on Pesach. But there are other hot boxes that are used particularly for cooking. They're not used for warming or keeping warm. They're used for cooking. Okay, those ones for some reason are not insulated, and also they typically don't have heaters on the bottom. They use sternos as the chafing fuel cans to keep to heat up the food. Now over there, since the food is not cooked, and the cooking is actually happening in the hot box, in this hot box, so it's important that there should be a very good circulation of air in the hot box. That is to say, if you put the sternos usually on the bottom, then the food on the bottom is going to get burnt, and the food on the top is not going to get cooked at all. So you want the air to move around, to be good circulation of air all through the whole chamber, and because of that they do have exhaust vents on the top. The idea being is that if there's an exhaust vent on the top, the hot air rises and escapes out of that exhaust vent, and it causes like a draft of air. The air is constantly moving from the bottom to the top. They even will align the trays in good ways to make a nice path for the air to keep flowing back and forth through all the different parts of it. And those ones typically will have an exhaust vent to them. Okay, different than the warming ones, where basically the food's cooked ready. You just need a warm chamber, and there they don't need the air. They don't want the hot air to escape. Here they bedafka want the hot air to escape, not inherently because they want the hot air to get out, but they're doing it because they want good air circulation, which will help make sure all the food gets really cooked. Okay, now as far as what's considered large and small, so the Mechaber says it's the amount a chamber that could hold all the matzahs that you can make from 12 esronim of flour. Okay, well, what does that mean? An issur is a shir challah. That's the amount that you have to be mafresh challah from. So 12 shir challahs. Okay, and the place can tell us that that's about 60 cubic tefachim. Okay, cubic tefach means a tefach by tefach by tefach. A cube, that's a tefach. About 60 cubic tefachim. Okay, and just to pause for a second, the shaila has to do with how big. I'm really not going to get into the math over here. This is too hard to do orally. It really needs like a pen and paper. But it has to do with the thickness of the lechem apanim. Each of the lechem apanim is made from 2 esronim of flour, and the Kesem Mishnah and the Tiferes Yisrael bring rayas that the lechem apanim were about 3/4 of an etzba thick. There's 4 etzbos in a tefach, about 3/4 of an etzba thick, or 0.85 etzbos thick. And according to that, they come out that the shear of 12 esronim is between 56 and a quarter cubic tvachim and 63 and 3/4 cubic tvachim. So I'm just saying around to get to approximately 60 cubic tvachim. I'll mention that the Binis Adam has a completely different cheshbon. He brings a raya from what seems to be a simple reading of a Gemara and Be'ah that the 12 esronim is 300 cubic tvachim. Okay, that's 5 times the size of what the other people are saying this year is. And according to the Binis Adam, almost everything that we deal with is going to be considered small. Okay, just about everything that we have is going to be considered small. So we're ignoring that shita because the Kesef Mishnah and Tiferes Yisrael have rayas that differently, and that the shear of 12 esronim is about 60 cubic tvachim. Okay, again, if you want all the math, you have to read this part of it. Orally, the math is going to be too complicated to just explain all this math. Now, okay, so now I know that my shear is that the 12 esronim is 60 cubic tvachim. Okay, now for the purpose that we're going to talk today, for now, it's really not important to think about how many inches a tefach is, because I went through the math. It's all in Excel. I went through the math, and the difference between what I'm going to say here and there, it makes no difference whether whether something is large or small does not depend on how many inches are in a tefach. Okay, I mean maybe there'd be a specific device, but all the typical devices that I looked at, it made no difference whether you held this many inches or that many inches. So we'll work with tefachim. So we need 60 cubic tefachim. So there's 3 shitas of what to do. Well, they have an oven, and we have 60 cubic tefachim of matzah. What about them? So there's 3 shitas of which part of the oven do those 60 cubic tefachim have to fit into. So the most lenient is the Yad Eliyahu, who says the Yad Eliyahu lived in like 1700s, printed well before the other farm I'm going to mention in a second. The Yad Eliyahu says that an oven is considered large if the 12 esronim of the matzahs made out of 12 esronim of flour would fill up the entire airspace of the chamber, the whole thing. So so that's a really small shear because you have all the 12 esronim basically stuffing up the hole. If the whole chamber could be filled up with them, that's considered a large oven. Okay, there's the middle shita of the Crazy Placey, which the Chacham Sadim thinks is correct. The Chacham Sadim follows the shita. He says we imagine the 12 esronim of matzah are along the 4 walls of the oven that covered with matzahs that are each a tefach thick. So if we take matzahs that are tefach thick and line the walls of the oven with those matzahs, then if that's 12 esronim, then it's a large oven. If it holds less than 12 esronim, then it's a small oven. Okay, according to these 2 opinions that I just told you, this Yad Eliyahu or the Crazy Placey, then a standard home oven that we have is considered large. Okay, again, if you want to see the numbers, you tell me, and I'll show you the math. That it's considered large. Those are 2 of the shitas. The third sheet is Pri Chodesh and some others. Excuse me. And the Chazdas is one of the people who says like that. Also, the Pri Chodesh says that he's the most machmer, and he says is the 12 esronim have to fit onto the floor of the oven and be a tefach thick matzahs on the floor of the oven. Okay, so that's the most machmer because it's saying we only have basically one surface to cover with those 12 esronim. If you can't fit all 12 onto the floor, being just one tefach thick, that's not considered a large oven. Pri Megadim follows the sheet also. So that, according to them, a typical home oven that most of has is only going to be 60% of a large oven. It would not be considered large; it would be considered small. Okay, so like a microwave and a toaster oven, those are for sure small. But the regular home oven, according to 2 of these sheets, is going to be large. According to this last sheet, the Pri Chodesh, it's not going to be. It would be considered small. Again, it's relevant to very specific cases, not so typically relevant to us. Whether it's large, it happens to be, as I mentioned, it's not so relevant to us whether it's large or small. Okay. Now, the last thing to talk about, third thing we could do today, the third small thing we're going to do today, is still in Siman Kuf Ches Halacha Aleph, and there's at the very end of the din, the Ramah says, Ein lekaman soif Siman Kuf Yud Ches. Go look at the end of Siman Kuf Yud Ches if you should be machmir about putting 2 pots side by side when one has kosher and one has treif in them. Are you allowed to roast one food next to the other when one is kosher and one is treif? Okay, that's what he tells you to do. Okay, so let's go look in Siman Kuf. I'm sorry. Well, let's go look at Siman Kuf Yud Ches and see what goes on with it. The Mechaber there says it's completely mutter. What the Ramah just described, putting two pots next to each other, one with kasher, one with issur, one with heter, is completely treif, completely perfect. You're allowed to do that, even lechatchila. And the Ramah says that lechatchila, the Ramah in Kuf Yud Ches says lechatchila you should avoid it. Okay. And the question is, what's the reason? Why did Ramah over there say you should avoid putting pots side by side? He's telling you over here, go look over there, and you're going to see what I said over there, which is that lechatchila you shouldn't put the pots side by side. So, what's Siman Kuf Yud Ches? So, Siman Kuf Yud Ches is all about the kind of situations when you have to be worried that someone who is not kosher or not Jewish switch tray food for kosher food. Like, for example, the Ramah is telling you to look at a certain din. Like, for example, the one there is about what happens if you leave someone who's not Jewish in your home with your food. When do you have to be concerned that they might switch your kosher food for tray, and when do you not have to be? That's the whole siman is about those kind of things, is being concerned that the person you had kosher food, and now you think you still have that same food. When do you have to be choshesh that he switched it? Okay? So, the fact that this din is in Kuf Yud Ches, is in that siman, gives the impression that the shaila is, if you have the two pots side by side, so you have a kosher pot, you have kosher food cooking, and the guy has tray food, the chashash is maybe switch it. They're right next to each other, so it's really easy to switch it. And even if there's yetziv nichnas, that's what the chashash lechatchila is. Even though you're in and out, you're in the area, keeping an eye on things. Even so, they're so close, it's so easy to switch them. That's what you have to be choshesh that he would switch. That's what this you might think if you look at the fact that from its placement. But on the other hand, it is, I'll mention that the Mechaber there, when he talks about that, it's completely mutter. He says, and don't worry about one food spraying, about the tray food spritzing onto your kosher food. You don't have to worry about that. So maybe that's why the Rambam is machmir. Maybe he's saying lechatchila you should be choshesh that it's spritz. You know, maybe not the evid, but at least lechatchila be choshesh. Okay, so which one is it? Is the problem is it that you're afraid that they might have switched the tray for the kosher, or is the problem is the food might spritz from one to the other? So the Taz says, like the first way I said, which was that you're afraid that the guy might switch treif for kosher. Okay, that's what the Taz says. Like all the rest of Siman Kuf Yud Ches. So he says, if what happens if there's no guy around? He says, like, let's say, for example, I have two pots or two things cooking. One's kosher, they're both kosher, but one's milchik, one's fleshik. There's no guy. There's no one who's going to try to switch it around like that. So he says, no problem. You can do whatever you want to. There's no issue of no possibility of some no possibility of someone switching them. Why would anybody switch them? There's no one here who would possibly do that. So it says it's completely mutter. And the truth is, if you look at the Darkei Moshe in Siman Kuf Yud Ches, the Darkei Moshe says you should know the issur heter says that even though in the case of kosher and treif you shouldn't do it lechatchila. The issur heter says, but you can have it's okay to do it if a yid stands there the entire time. Okay, so according to the Taz, it makes a lot of sense. If the chashash is that he might switch them, well, then if you have a guard standing there making sure every minute that he can't switch, you don't even walk away for a minute. You come always there to make sure the switch is not a problem. Okay, if the chashash was spraying, standing and watching is not going to do any good. It doesn't help to watch it to make sure that it doesn't spray. It's going to spray if it wants to. No, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, but okay, that's reasons to think like the Taz. However, the Darkei Moshe also says over there in Siman Kuf Yud Ches, he tells you, go look in Siman Kuf Ches. Okay, now what does our din have anything to do with this? He said, go look in Siman Kuf Ches. What am I going to see? Kuf Ches is our din. Halacha is about Reichah and Zayah and things like that. What does that have to do with Goyim switching food from one to the other one? Okay, and for that matter, why does the Ramah in our halacha tell you to go look in Siman Kuf Yud Ches? Again, our halacha is about Reichah, but food. Spraying about time transferring between foods without them touching each other. What does that have to do with Goyim switching pots, and maybe they'll take your kosher meat and give you their treif meat instead? What does it have to do with each other? Why is Ramah? They both have to do with foods that are next to each other. But I mean, the connection is very tenuous. I mean, it's like they're both about food next to each other. But our din is about zayah when you have pots about time transferring, and over there it's about garment switching. There's not really a connection. So these all point to the way the Shach says. The Shach says that the Ramah, the reason why the Ramah in Siman Kuf Yud Ches says you shouldn't put the pots next to each other is because he's afraid of spritzing. That some of the treif might might spray onto the kosher food and make that food treif. Okay, so the Ramah over here in Siman Kuf Ches is saying, I told you that there are certain cases where the din is that there is no chashash of Reichah. You don't have to worry about Reichah transferring, time transferring. Sometimes Reichah is so minimal, you don't have to worry about it transferring. But l'chatchila, you should avoid it. So so now looking at Siman Kuf Yud Ches, where you're going to see there's another thing. You don't have to ever be worried about that time spritz from food, something spritz from the treif to the kosher, but l'chatchila, you should be worried. So it's a similar idea that there's no real chash b'di'evet that something got from one to the other, but even l'chatchila, you should avoid it. Okay, and the Shach says you should know there's a raya that I'm right to this, because if you look at the Ramah, he says he says l'chatchila, you shouldn't put kosher and treif to broil next to each other. He says afilu, you should even be machmir if they're cooking in pots. He says now if the chashash is that someone might switch one for the other, what's the difference if it's in a pot? Well, if it's in a pot or not, or just like roasting without a pot. If switching is switching, who cares? Why is it even be machmir in a pot? He says my way makes sense, because if something is enclosed in a pot, then it's less likely that it's going to spritz, because it's hard to get out, because there are walls all around the food, as opposed to if it's just broiling open, then it is more likely, it's more reasonable to be concerned that food might spray from one to the other one. Okay, so he says that's mashma, like I'm saying that the chashash is spritzing. If the chashash is switching, like if chashash, like the Taz said, of someone switching the food, then it doesn't really make so much sense. There's no afilu. Why is the case of a pot different than the other case? Okay, so I mean, okay, the Taz will probably say that the answer is that it's easier to switch foods when they're exposed and when they're covered, when they're in a pot. Okay, but that's the Shach's question. Now, the Shach says, since I'm telling you that the concern here is just that the person, that it might spray from one to the other, if that's the chashash, then if the pots are covered, then there's no problem. Because even the Ramah will allow you to do it l'chatchila, because if the pot is completely, it's not just in a pot, it's a pot that's covered, then it can't spritz from one to the other one. Okay, and of course you have to have yetzer v'nichnas. If there's a guy, that's a separate din. But as far as spritzing, no problem of spritzing. The Taz will hold the Taz is not going to agree to that. Covering is not going to make a difference. The chashash that someone might switch it doesn't change because it's covered. Now, also, but the shach is a chumrah, because I told you before that the Taz says that if both foods are kosher, just like one's milchigs, one's fleishigs, then there's no problem. According to the shach, that continues to be a problem. It's still a problem whether if one is milchigs, one is fleishigs, it's the same problem of things spritzing, so the same kind of an issue. Excuse me. And the same kind of an issue, even if one is kosher, even if one is milchigs and one is fleishigs. So the possibility of the case for the Taz says, which is for kosher and treif, is not so relevant to people. I mean, how many people have treif food cooking in their house? And I mean, maybe it could be relevant to a caterer. A caterer could be working in a treif kitchen where, like, let's say there's an event in a hotel, so it's a treif kitchen, and they could be cooking treif and he'd be cooking kosher. So I guess in theory that could happen. And the Taz would say you should be choishish that someone might switch it unless someone is standing there right there to keep an eye on it, literally standing there, not even yetzer v'nichnas, actually standing by. But it could be such a thing like that. but I mean, in practice, no reputable hashgacha would allow that to have mamash kosher and treif. Even if they didn't ever hear of this Taz, they on their own would realize that this is not a good situation. It's only going to cause problems if we have kosher and treif cooking right side by side. But the shash, which says applies even by kosher meat and kosher milk, we are concerned about spraying. That he learns, that's why the Ramah says you shouldn't do it l'chatchila. That is quite relevant to people who have just one stovetop and use the same stovetop for kosher and treif. Now, we talked about once beforehand about if there's a chashash, is that a problem for the grates? The fact that I'm using the same grate for milchigs and fleishigs, is that a problem or is that not a problem? But here we're talking about I'm not talking about here talking about grates. I'm talking about that there are two burners side by side. One is milchigs and one is fleishigs, and so they're not using the same grate. So the question is that okay? So if the food could spray from one to another, from one side, from one pot to the other, then if they're covered, you're okay. But if they're not, the Shach said himself said it's okay. But if they're not covered, then according to the Shach, we have this chashash that Ramos says you should be choshesh that food will spritz from one to the other one. So, so however, that idea, this possibility that might spritz, is only assuming that they're close by. I mean, it's logical, but if you care, the Pri Megadim actually speaks it out specifically that if the pots are miruchakim from one another, they're far away from each other, then you don't have this chashash that's going to spritz from one to the other one. Again, I mentioned if they're covered, for sure you don't have a chashash, but also if they're far away from each other, and that term "far" is of course very vague. It's not so clear, and very much depends on the factors. I suspect that an easy way to separate them is to say it's like this. In most ovens, the burners are 2 on the left and 2 on the right. So I suspect that the burners that are both on the same side, let's say both burners on the right side are the front and the back one. Those are close to each other, and it's a real chashash that things could spitz from one to the other one, as opposed to from the left to the right. Maybe I'm wrong. In my mind, those are far enough apart from each other, or at least in most ovens, that most stovetops, that's considered far away. You don't have to be choshesh something's going to spritz from one to the other. That even that case, even number wouldn't even say lechatchila you should avoid it. Okay, but of course it's very much depends on the situation. And lastly is that this whole possibility of thinking of things spritzing from one to the other is only lechatchila. The Rama said it to avoid lechatchila, but b'diavad it would not be a concern.